afternoon, and welcome to Day 3 of the ALCTS Virtual Symposium, Turn Your Idea into a Publication. I'm Mary Miller, Chair of the ALCTS Publications Committee, and I'll be your host for this afternoon session entitled The Publishing Process. Our presenters today are Mary Beth Weber, Pamela Bluh, and Christine McConnell. Mary Beth Weber is Head of Central Technical Services at Rutgers University Libraries. She has published books on cataloging and RDA and served as an associate editor for the international journal Libris. She is an active member of ALCTS and served for 6 years as the editor of the association's online newsletter. She is currently the editor of Library Resources and Technical Services, ALCTS official journal, which is also one of the top-ranked scholarly journals for technical services research. Pamela Bluh retired in 2014 as the Associate Director for Technical Services and Administration of the Thurgood Marshall Law Library of the University of Maryland School of Law. She has also been active in ALCTS for many years, serving as Chair of the ALCTS Fundraising and Continuing Education Committees and as ALCTS President in 2007 to 2008. She edited the ALCTS Papers series for 3 years as well. She was awarded the Ulrich Serials Librarianship Award in 2004 and in 2012 received the Ross Atkinson Lifetime Achievement Award. She is currently serving as an ex officio member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and chairing the Webinar Development Subcommittee. Christine McConnell handles publishing and production in the ALCTS office in Chicago. She managed ALA's in-house print production unit for 3 years and has been the ALCTS Communications Specialist since 2005. Christine has a degree in English from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and, fun fact, began her career at a small textbook publisher where she copy-edited materials on operating industrial boilers and air conditioning units. In the first part of this session, Mary Beth will discuss the processes that take place after a paper is submitted to a peer-reviewed scholarly journal. She will also address how to identify an appropriate journal for your paper, how a research paper is structured, and steps to follow to prepare a paper for submission. The session will include strategies for interacting with editors, authors' rights, and ethics in publishing. In the second part of our session, Pamela will discuss her experience as both a writer and an editor throughout her career. Finally, Christine will walk us through the basics of turning a manuscript into a finished product. Just a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. If you wish to comment on the presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag that you see on your screen. However, we will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. If you have any questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen, and they will be answered as time permits at the end of the presentation. Questions that remain unanswered while we are on the air will be answered offline, and the answers will be sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation, and an evaluation within 2 days. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. And now there will be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Mary Beth.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone who took the time to fill out the survey before the workshop. That was very valuable. I initially thought it would be mostly newbies, but I was pleasantly surprised to see a good mix of people, including somebody who was a Best of Alerts Award winner. As Mary said, I'm going to talk about the process of submitting a paper to a scholarly journal, and I'm also going to talk about some of the behind-the-scenes things that happen and give you the editor's perspective. I want to talk about how the publishing process starts. It starts with an idea, and your own work is the best source of ideas. Write about what you know. You might have developed a solution for an issue in the profession and want to share it. You can also take a presentation one step further and develop it into a publication. And as I said before, most importantly, focus on something you know. Write about something you know. I also want to mention that the ALCTS website provides instructions on how to turn a presentation into a research paper. And at the end of my presentation, I have a list of resources, and that includes information from the ALCTS website. Okay, I wanted to start by talking about first steps if you're new to publishing. It's okay to start small. You don't have to start with a book, a chapter in a book, or something major, or a paper. You can start with a book review or media reviews as well. Educational media reviews online, or EMRO, is published by the State University of New York at SUNY Buffalo. That's also a place where you can review. And there are some ALCTS venues where you can also start small, such as the ALCTS book reviews, Z687, or the ALCTS News. And I want to talk a little bit about those venues. The ALCTS book review editor is Alyssa Gould, and there is information on the ALCTS website if you are interested in serving as a reviewer. Z687 is a collection of white papers, and they're always looking for authors. And then the ALCTS News as well, Rebecca Mugridge is the editor, and she always needs conference reports for ALA, Midwinter, or annual. And in addition, if you've gone to a conference and you feel that it's interesting and you want to share it with her, feel free to contact her and ask about having it included in the ALCTS News. Okay, I want to move on to talking about finding a venue for your paper. One of the things you'll want to do is to research potential paper topics in the professional literature so that you can see what other papers have been published on your topic or are related to your topic to support your research. You will also want to check the journal scope to see if it includes the topic, your topic, because there's no point in submitting something to a journal that doesn't cover your area. I also want to encourage you to feel free to contact the journal editor with your idea and to ask for feedback. I'm frequently contacted by people if I have an idea or I've done research. Do feel free to reach out to somebody if you have an idea. And going back to that first point, as far as researching potential topics, you also want to make sure that the market isn't oversaturated. For example, there are already a lot of papers on PDA or RDA, and unless you're going to write something new and innovative on those topics, be careful. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about finding a venue for your paper. You'll also want to review the journal's editorial policy to see what type of review is provided. Is it double-blind peer review, for example? The turnaround time from submission to completion of review is important too, particularly if you're going through a personal action and you need publications. Journals vary in the amount of time that they take. With ALCTS, we try to get something published within 6 months from the time of submission to acceptance of a paper. Sometimes it varies. It can take longer. Sometimes it's shorter. There are journals I know that can take up to a year to publish something. So again, the turnaround time is important. You want to investigate that. You'll also want to know, what does editing entail? Is it copy editing? Is it something more extensive? Is it feedback regarding your research and so on? And then, of course, how much revision will be required after a paper is returned to authors? With ALCTS, I return a marked up copy of the author's paper with comments from me as well as the 2 reviewers, and authors are responsible for making all those changes, which can be time-consuming. Some additional considerations. Check the journal's website for information such as the impact factor and most downloaded papers. I always like to look at downloaded papers to see which ones are popular and who's written them, if they're people I know or if they're published in my journal. You'll also want to investigate things like who holds the copyright and what restrictions exist if you own the copyright versus the journal. If open access is important to you, does it support green or gold? And if it's gold open access, who pays for it? Are there grants available to the author from his or her institution or funding source? And on the point of open access, I want to talk a little bit about it in case people aren't familiar with it. Green OA supports self-archiving, in an open access institutional repository, whereas Gold OA relates to publishing. And I want to quote from an article by Micah Vandegrift and Chelsea Bowley. The article is titled, "Librarian Heal Thyself, a Gold OA Relates to Publishing Analysis of LAS Journals." They looked at 56 journals that offered open access on an article by article basis. that require a processing fee, and these fees range from $300 to $3,000. And of those 56 journals, 52 were published by commercial publishers such as Elsevier, Sage, Springer, Wiley, and so on. And I do have a link to that article at the end of my presentation as well. Some other additional considerations: can your paper be deposited in an institutional repository? If so, are there restrictions? With ALCTS, for example, authors can deposit their published paper, but it has to be the form in which it was published in ALCTS with no additional changes made to it, and we do provide a PDF. If you work somewhere that does not have access to an IR, ALCTS and ALA do have an IR. It's called ALA Air, and I listed that in my list of resources at the end of my presentation. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about are the elements of a research paper, and I am going to go over these point by point, but the elements of a research paper are your introduction. It should include a literature review, your research method, your results or findings, discussion and or analysis of your research, and your conclusion. And the ALCTS website does provide information on how to write a research paper, and it does address each of these points as well. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the introduction. It sets the tone for your paper. It explains what will be presented. It captures your readers with a powerful hook. You want to grab the reader's attention from the beginning and hold it. If you don't get them in the introduction, they may not want to or feel compelled to continue reading your paper. And it also explains why the author's findings matter to the reader. Okay, as I mentioned, the literature review is also an important part of research papers. In your literature review, you'll review the professional literature to see what's been written on your topic or related topics that support your research. Places where you could look are library and information science databases plus Google Scholar. And if you're unclear as to how to conduct a literature review, Purdue's online writing lab, referred to as the OWL, does include a document on literature reviews, and also just a Google search will provide links to several resources on how to conduct and write a literature review that are quite good. Okay, following up on that, I want to talk about the research method, which it explains the methods or procedures that are used to demonstrate the validity of your results. If you do use a survey or other measurement instruments, you should include them in the appendix. They do not go in the body of your paper. And if you include statistics and numbers, make sure that they're correct. Ensure they're correct. Have a second person look at them. If you have access to someone like a statistician, I encourage you to have someone of that sort look at them as well. Right, following up on that is your results or findings. This is the quantitative or qualitative data from your research. You can include tables, figures, and illustrations to help visually present your research. However, they should be clearly labeled and easy to read. I do want to say limit your use of tables, figures, and so on to avoid overwhelming your readers. I did once get a paper that actually had 20 tables in it. We were able to get the author to consolidate them. That's far too many. Another thing is if you do include things like tables, figures, and so on in your paper, I always refer to them, for example, see figure 1 and so on. I find that people don't do that, and their significance is lost if you don't refer to them. Okay, the next part of a research paper is your discussion or analysis. This is where you provide an argument to support your research findings. You'll interpret your data for readers, explain how your findings support your research, and discuss how your research compares to what you included in your literature review. More on the discussion or analysis, you can discuss problems encountered with your research, including what you could have done differently, what you learned from the experience, and also state if further research is needed. This is particularly important for new and emerging topics. Okay, and the last part, last but not least, of a research paper is your conclusion. You want to end with a strong conclusion, restate your main points, and reiterate why your findings are important and why readers should care about them. Okay, I'm going to move into preparing your paper. Now that I've talked about the parts of a research paper, I want to discuss how to prepare it. Guidelines for preparing and submitting papers to a journal should be prominently featured on a journal's website. When you're going to prepare a paper, you want to look at a journal submission guidelines and see what's the required word length, what style manuals required. And I'm going to say a little bit more about style manuals later because they are very important. Keep in mind that you should submit only original unpublished papers. Don't submit a paper to more than one journal at the same time. This is unethical. I've had that happen to me. Also, if a paper is based on a presentation, state this in an acknowledgement at the beginning of your paper. Okay, these are just some helpful tips, some basic tips, do's and don'ts. When you're preparing a paper for submission, you do need to check your facts for accuracy. Make sure your citations are complete and accurate. There are many times when people do not include all the information, and I do need to go and check on all their citations. Do write clearly and avoid wordiness. Don't use phrases like in order to, as a result of, because I can assure you one of the reviewers, myself, or a copy editor will remove those. As far as don'ts, don't use slang, jargon, or trendy expressions. What might seem cool now will be dated in a few years. This goes without saying. Don't use contractions in formal writing. I see this over and over again. And lastly, don't include identifying information in your paper. And this is important if you're submitting something to a journal that gets double-blind review, because you want to make sure that your name and any information that can identify you is not included in the paper so that the reviewers can give a fair and impartial review of your paper. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about style manual, which I said before I was going to address. The style manual is very important. This is where I sound like a high school English teacher, but it is very important. It provides guidance in formatting your paper, including tables, citations, and so on. And if you don't use the required style manual, it will slow down the process of review and revision. In my review, I'm going to have to go through and indicate every change that has to be made when I return a paper to an author. Then that author has to go ahead and make all those changes, which will slow down his or her revision of the paper too. And you are responsible for making the suggested changes before your paper is considered for publication. When ALCTS authors revise and resubmit a paper, they have to include a list of all the changes they've made and a rebuttal if they don't agree with the suggested change. Okay, a little bit more in the style manual. If you don't have access to a print or electronic copy of a journal's required style manual, and the price is a deterrent, which they can be very expensive, Purdue's online writing lab, OWL, which I mentioned before, does have an overview of the major style manuals and very good examples as well. And another thing you can do is check copies of the journal that you're interested in, for example, to see how papers are formatted. A little bit more about the style manual. If you're in doubt about how to format something, ask the editor. I'm always surprised at how people do not ask things early in the process. This is preferable to guessing and asking incorrect or including incorrect information in your paper that I can assure you will need to be changed later. Another thing I want to say about the style of a paper and formatting, if you've submitted a paper previously to another journal and it uses a different style manual, don't recycle it. Reformat it according to the style manual of the journal to which you're submitting. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about ethics in publishing. As I mentioned earlier, authors are responsible for the accuracy of statements made in their paper, and it's important that you give credit to all content that's taken from other papers, even if it's from a paper you've published yourself. If you don't provide attribution for papers you've published, this is considered self-plagiarism. Because you've published something and it's your writing does not really mean that you own it. You don't have the right to reuse that content as if it were new. And I want to read a quote from the APA manual that defines both plagiarism and self-plagiarism in this way. Whereas plagiarism refers to the practice of claiming credit for the words, ideas, and concepts of others, self-plagiarism refers to the practice of presenting one's own previously published work as though it were new. So there is such a thing. Sometimes people are surprised to hear that, but bear that in mind. Okay, I'm going to move into submitting your paper. You've done your research, you're ready to go, so you're going to submit your paper to an editor. And websites should have information on how to submit it. Many journals use an online submission system. Not all of them do, but those that do use it to track when a paper is submitted, when it's reviewed, when a revision's been submitted, and so on. I find it very helpful if reviewers are behind, for example. I get a message that says they're late with their reviews. When you submit a paper, the editor will acknowledge receipt of your paper, explain it's been assigned for review, and when you can expect to receive a response regarding your paper. Okay, after you submit your paper, it's going to undergo the review process. Editorial boards are composed of experts, people who are experts in the topics that are covered by that journal, who also have a strong publication record. Many journals, scholarly journals, including ALCTS, papers undergo a double-blind peer review plus the editor's review. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, it means that your paper is assigned to 2 reviewers. They don't know your identity, nor will you know theirs, nor will those 2 reviewers know who else is reviewing the paper. The reviewers are given a specified time period to review the papers, read them, and return comments to the editor. And the editor may contact the author during the review process if there's questions or if additional information is needed. This is a little bit more about the review process. When reviews are complete, ideally the editor should return compiled reviewer comments and a markup copy of the paper to the author. The majority of papers, regardless of how well written, do require revision and resubmission. And there's different statuses. For example, with ALCTS, there's a paper could be rejected but encouraged to resubmit, could be revised and resubmit, and so on. If somebody gets a request to revise and resubmit, it's not necessarily a guarantee your paper will be accepted for publication. With ALCTS, a paper can undergo sometimes a second double-blind review depending on the extent of the revisions that were required. I can also note that papers in some cases might be rejected outright after the initial review, and keep in mind the editor's final decision is guided by the reviewer's expertise and recommendations. While nobody likes to think about rejected papers, I do want to take some time to talk about them. There's a variety of reasons why a paper is rejected. It might contain information that's not factually correct, plagiarism or self-plagiarism, as I mentioned earlier. It could have a lack of stated research questions. It's not clear what the author is investigating or trying to demonstrate. It could also contain faulty or incorrect research methodology. And lastly, paper could be poorly formatted, difficult to read, and lack a convincing argument or supporting information. There are also circumstances when an author decides to withdraw a paper, and there are reasons, various reasons why. Probably the most common ones are that an author's switched jobs and doesn't have time to revise the paper, or is no longer interested in it because the topic's no longer relevant to that person's work. There are cases where the author feels the requested revisions are too extensive and doesn't want to invest the time. And there are cases too where an author doesn't agree with the suggested revisions and decides to part ways with the journal. I've talked a lot about the submission process in papers. I want to talk too about interacting with editors. If you have ideas, do inquire about ideas for papers. Contact the editor. Feel free to contact the editor during the review process or when your paper's been returned. There is no reason why you can't ask, what's the status of my paper? What about this? If your paper's been rejected, you should consider contacting the editor and ask for advice and possible next steps. There have been cases when I have worked with somebody to find another venue to submit their paper. And then do keep in mind the editor's decisions are guided by the expertise of the editorial board members. They're not out to ruin you. They are working on the recommendations of their editorial board. One of the last steps in the process, publishing process, is when papers are accepted. When this happens, the editor notifies the authors the paper is accepted, and this should include when the paper will be published and ideally in what issue the journal will appear. The editor and authors typically receive proofs of review and correct, and authors may be asked to sign copyright forms that govern who holds the copyright and any restrictions. And for myself, with ALCTS, at this point, once the paper is accepted, this is when I turn it over to Christine McConnell and ALA Production Services, and they take the journal to the next step. And I just want to end by recapping some of the main points of what I covered. As I mentioned early on, the best source of inspiration is your own work. Write about what you know. If you've given a presentation, consider getting additional mileage out of it. Do reach out to editors, even if you have an idea or your paper is not suitable for their journal. They do have contacts and they can provide guidance. As I said before, use the style manual. I can't stress that enough. You're also responsible for the accuracy of facts presented in your paper. And if a paper is rejected, it's not necessarily the end of the road. And at this point, this is the end of my presentation, I do have a couple pages of resources, things that I mentioned in my presentation, which will be available to you afterward. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Pamela Bluh, and there will be a few minutes, there'll be a slight delay when we switch between speakers, and thank you.
Presentation. It is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk about a subject that has always interested me and that is, I hope, equally appealing to you. A few weeks ago, Mary Miller asked me to step in to give this presentation, and after agreeing, I asked for advice on what I should cover. Although my usual style is more impersonal, at Mary's suggestion, I am going to share with you some of my experiences as an author and an editor. You know the old saying, the first step is the hardest. When I start writing a writing project, I paraphrase it as, the first word is the hardest. Perhaps that is your experience as well. Some might consider it procrastination, but I don't look at it that way. Rather, I think of it as a time when the project exists somewhere between the conscious and the subconscious, and I consider it time well spent in the service of creation. I tend to approach writing in a very linear fashion, first creating an outline and working my way through from introduction to conclusion. My outlines are usually very basic, just enough information to give the project a framework. The nice thing about a basic outline is that it can easily be modified. Details can be added or removed, and the sequence of information can be altered. The outline serves as my blueprint, helping me visualize the totality of the project, observing the relationship between topics, and making it easy to shape the project while it is still in the conceptual stage. With a basic outline, I'm ready, figuratively speaking, to take the first step, to write the first word. I'm reminded of the phrase, pencil poised, ready for action, an expression used long ago by one of my high school teachers. Today we'd more likely say, fingers poised over the keyboard, waiting for inspiration. Although sometimes I wonder whether pen and paper result in a more satisfying first draft than keyboarding. Perhaps that is because writing is slower than keyboarding, allowing thoughts to form more fully. Even with a simple outline which you can adjust as your thoughts evolve, the first step might be difficult. Sometimes the harder you try, the worse the writer's block becomes. One technique I use to get over that hurdle is to ask myself, what am I trying to say? What point am I trying to make? I stop stressing about creating the perfect opening sentence and focus on simply expressing the thought. I try to take the pressure off by jotting down a few words. As silly as it may seem, I might make a list of words I would like to use, and often that helps me to get started. A technique like that can serve as a transition into the work, and later, during the stages of revision, you may even discover that those first words are more appropriate elsewhere, perhaps even as the conclusion, or they may not survive the final draft, but they will have served their purpose to motivate you to take the first step. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before tackling the introduction, before the first word is written, there must be an idea. Where do ideas come from? I'd like to suggest that ideas and inspiration can be found all around us by keeping the 3 R's in mind. One of the best ways to hone your writing skills is to read a lot. Read fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama, newspapers, even the comics, obituaries, and advertisements. Reading exposes you to an array of points of view, opinions, and attitudes, as well as many different styles of writing. The more you read, the more discriminating you will become, and the more easily you will sense when the germ of an idea emerges. When you read mindfully, you will develop a critical sense, figuring out which authors you prefer, which you may not care for, what writing styles appeal to you, and what you might emulate in your own work, and what you want to avoid. Ideas will be revealed through reading. In parallel with reading, take advantage of any opportunity that is offered to write. Write for work, reports, performance reviews, letters of reference. Write for pleasure. Writing is hard, but the more you write, the more confidence you will gain in your abilities. Take care with your choice of words and heed the phrase, "words matter," even for something as seemingly simple as an email message or a tweet. The third R stands for revise. This is perhaps the most challenging of the 3 R's to practice. Revision implies that there is room for improvement. If you tend to be your own harshest critic and have agonized over your work, you may view suggestions for revisions less than enthusiastically. However, even the most fastidious writer benefits from constructive criticism. Although I tend to be very critical of my own work, I confess that my writing has always been improved by carefully considered comments, whether offered informally or formally by colleagues and friends. Several of the sessions that you've attended this week have focused on the requirements and techniques for writing a research paper. But what if writing a research paper is not your forte? That should not prevent you from seeking out other opportunities to write. As Mary Beth mentioned in her presentation, start by writing about something you know, perhaps by describing a project in which you are involved at work or sharing information on a topic of particular interest, such as a hobby. My first published article in ALCTS was only 5 pages, of which 2 pages were charts and described a collection inventory project. Later, during a period when I was active with the Potters Guild of Baltimore, I co-authored a piece on pottery and ceramics, which appeared in Serial's Review. You may wonder who would be interested in something that you consider mundane, and be surprised that articles describing procedures and current practices, for example, those conveying details about using emerging technologies, are often sought after and very much in demand. The ALCTS column, Notes on Operations, continues this tradition, and publications such as Against the Grain and Technicalities regularly include columns devoted to practical matters. ALCTS publications, including the ALCTS News, which Mary Beth mentioned, as well as the Sudden Selectors Guides, the Guides on Acquisitions and Collections, and the Z687, Creating the Future of Technical Services, all offer opportunities to showcase pieces with real-world applications. And don't overlook the ALCTS monographs that concentrate on in-depth studies of contemporary issues. There is nothing wrong with starting modestly. Bigger is not necessarily better. A paragraph or 2 describing a conference program, and by the way, is anyone reporting on this virtual symposium? A blog entry, a pithy tweet, and a book review are all valuable. Converting, or if you prefer, adapting, a conference presentation can also provide a great segue into writing. After all, you've done the hard work of putting the presentation together, so that all that is necessary is reformatting the content into a readable structure. Also, keep in mind that you do not need to fly solo on a writing project. In fact, collaborating with a colleague may be advantageous. Joining forces with an individual with different strengths or skills, with a complementary point of view, or from a different professional background can be equally instructive for novice as well as veteran writers. If you aren't sure about tackling a project alone, find a partner and see how things work out. Some projects benefit from collaboration, whereas others are better managed individually. As you embark on a writing project, whether alone or with a partner, be sure to understand the parameters of the assignment. Is it to provide only a paragraph or 2, or are you expected to write 2,000 words? Is there a deadline, and if so, how firm is it? Is it negotiable? If you are collaborating, be sure to come to an understanding of your responsibilities vis-a-vis your partner and the overall assignment. It is really important to work out as many details as possible in advance in order to avoid misunderstandings and disappointments. This is crucial not only in relation to the subject matter to be covered, but also with regard to a timeline. Be realistic about your capabilities and skills. Will you need time to gather background information, or do you have all the details you need at your fingertips? Are your citations complete and accurate? It is very upsetting, not to mention time-consuming, to re-research references, particularly if they are to online sources. And we all know how transient some of those can be. And speaking from experience, verify the required citation style early in the process, since there is nothing more frustrating than revising references under a time constraint when the project is complete. Is the timetable acceptable? Can you complete the task within the time limit that is proposed? If your goal is to include the piece on which you have labored so diligently on your CV for a promotion and tenure review, have you factored in the time needed for publication? As an author, I always prefer to err on the side of a longer timeline rather than underestimating the time needed and asking for one or even several extensions. In fact, a good rule of thumb might be to allow twice as much time as you think you'll need to write half as many words. Authors who follow instructions and consistently meet or exceed deadlines are highly valued by editors. The opposite is also the case. In addition, it may be worth noting that the library and information industry is small, comparatively speaking, and notwithstanding the explosion of social media sites where anyone can be an author and there may be less rigor about a perfect product, the number of peer-reviewed publishing venues is limited, and consequently, reputation matters. Authors aren't the only ones with deadlines. Editors must also adhere to deadlines, and even a single delay can sidetrack an entire project. For a project such as a journal issue or a book with multiple chapters written by different authors, granting one author an extension is unfair to all the authors who contributed their work on time, and in addition, it can snowball into missed deadlines for printing, marketing, indeed for the entire publishing continuum. Editors frequently face this situation as they fashion the individual pieces into a cohesive whole. Balancing individual needs with a project's overall objective takes diplomacy and determination. So, speaking of editors, what is the role of the editor? My vision of an editor is that of a conductor, attending to the minutiae of the job while keeping an eye on the big picture. She must establish and meet deadlines, solicit contributions, submit manuscripts, encourage and motivate authors and keep them on task, help with marketing, and coordinate with the publisher. Perhaps rather than a conductor, a more apt analogy would be to that of a juggler. An editor must be diplomatic and tactful. She should be mindful of both the personalities and the writing styles of the authors with whom she interacts. She needs to be aware that authors respond to editorial direction in many different ways and adjust her approach to each author based on her understanding of those differences. The editor needs to be part psychologist, part magician. Often, an editor works with several authors simultaneously. Consider Mary Beth as she organizes each issue of ALCTS, or the editor of a volume of essays, such as those published over the last few years in the ALCTS Papers series, now ALCTS Monographs. It is a luxury for an editor to deal with only one author at a time. Because an editor oversees several writing projects at the same time, it is vitally important for her to be methodical, well-organized, and attentive to detail. Depending on the publication, editors may work alone or with an editorial board. When working with a group, whether formally or informally, editors traditionally provide guidance and leadership. Individual board members may volunteer for or be required to take on specific tasks, such as contacting authors, serving as column editors, or providing peer reviews of submitted content. The editor's leadership style and the degree of direction she provides have a profound impact on everyone and everything associated with the publication. If you are considering a writing project and are scoping out various venues, you would be well advised to check on the specific requirements of each venue and contact the editors before you start writing. By being proactive in this way, you can find out for which publication your idea is appropriate, thus smoothing the way for a submission, or alternatively, avoiding the disappointment of a rejection. Familiarizing yourself with the requirements of a particular publication will allow you to tailor your work to meet those requirements and make the author-editor relationship much more pleasant and productive. Going one step further, and before getting too deeply involved in writing, consider submitting a formal proposal. A proposal is useful to help an author establish the parameters of the work and as a means of clarifying expectations regarding deadlines, copyright, payment of royalties, if any, and mitigating possible misunderstandings and disappointments as the work progresses. Information about submitting a proposal to an ALCTS publication can be found at the ALCTS website at the URL on your screen. An accepted publication proposal protects the interests of all the parties involved. Within our community, an editor may be called upon to perform other duties, including copy editing, or in extreme situations, even ghostwriting. What is a copy editor, and how do the duties of a copy editor differ from those of an editor? I consulted what we refer to at my house as, quote, the portal of information, unquote, for a definition of a copy editor. Someone who improves, quote, the formatting, style, and accuracy of the text, correcting spelling, punctuation, grammar, terminology, jargon, and semantics, unquote. In addition, I particularly like the following description. Copy editors may shorten the text to improve it or to fit length limits. In addition, they need, quote, good critical thinking skills in order to recognize inconsistencies or vagueness, interpersonal skills for dealing with writers, other editors, and designers, attention to detail, and a sense of style, unquote. Based on that description, I did a fair amount of copy editing while serving as editor of the ALCTS paper series. Several of the contributions were based on conference proceedings that required modifications in terms of voice and tense in order to achieve a cohesive product and bring clarity and organization to the work. For example, here is a passage from Perpetual Beta, one of the chapters in the book, The Institutional Repository, Benefits and Challenges, the last volume in the ALCTS Papers series, that I think illustrates this point very well. The upper paragraph, or a few sentences, represents the submitted version, which you can see is rather long, wordy, a little bit unclear, at least the editors thought so, and below the image of the book is the published version, shorter and more articulate. The most extreme editing I've ever performed occurred several years ago for a trio of librarians from Wuhan, China, eager to have their work published in an American journal. Although they hoped that the piece would be accepted for LERTS, that was not possible. After a conversation with the LERTS editor, I offered to work with them and persuaded a generous colleague who speaks Chinese to join me. Although the paper was submitted in English, there were many passages that were ambiguous, possibly because the authors used an online language translator. Initially, my colleague and I requested a Chinese version of the text. After spending considerable time producing a working English language version, we began the task of polishing the manuscript. After at least a year, during which the paper underwent numerous revisions, the authors received an offer of publication from Library Collections, Acquisitions, and Technical Services. Now, imagine our shock when we reviewed the submission draft and discovered that our names were listed as authors. A flurry of emails followed in which we thanked the authors for the compliment, but pointed out that the research, the analysis, and the conclusions, indeed everything, was their work, and our assignment had been to provide advice and assistance. In the end, we compromised by including an acknowledgement of our participation at the end of the paper. In my experience, such extraordinary editing is rare, but necessary in certain situations when the content is vital to the overall project, if the author is unable to undertake the revisions, or when a deadline is looming and the entire project is at risk. The Wuhan case was certainly extreme, yet I remember it as an extraordinary mentoring experience. We provided the editing know-how and the language skills the authors needed in order to expose their research to an English-speaking audience. In exchange, we were given a glimpse into their world. We learned a little bit about the Chinese system of higher education and gained an understanding of some of the obstacles the librarians faced in getting their scholarship published abroad. Serving as a mentor can be a rewarding experience. It is a way for those of us with the expertise and special skills to give back to the profession. After all, as we launched our writing careers, we surely benefited from the advice and encouragement of more knowledgeable senior colleagues. We wanted to give our Wuhan friends an opportunity to achieve their much-desired goal. When we learned that the lead author of the paper had published another paper in ALCTS in 2011, we felt that our combined efforts had been worthwhile. The editing performed for our Wuhan colleagues raises an interesting question. What distinguishes an editor from a mentor? At a very basic level, an editor works with an author on a specific project, whereas a mentor is available to work with an author on a variety of projects, such as an advisor, a coach, and even a cheerleader. The mentor may serve as a sounding board, offering advice and counsel and providing honest feedback and constructive criticism on a long-term basis. A mentor is someone in whom the author has confidence, perhaps a close friend or trusted colleague, whose advice can be relied upon to be fair and unbiased. Over the years, I've had several intense editing experiences, and I've wondered whether ALCTS would consider establishing a mentoring service for aspiring authors. After all, aren't we taught that one of librarianship's core values is altruism? Could such a program represent an opportunity for ALCTS? And could extending such a program to librarians who are not native English speakers provide a valuable service, as well as a platform for ALCTS to showcase its activities and services to the international community? I was happy to learn that the ALCTS Publications Committee has begun to consider the possibility of a mentoring program. And now let me bring the discussion to a practical conclusion and mention a few tips that I find useful when writing and revising both my own work and that of others. Read aloud. Reading your work aloud will help you to identify grammatical errors such as discrepancies between singular and plural, changing tenses and voices, or awkwardly worded passages. Avoid repetition. Try not to use the same word or phrase too many times in close proximity. Let the thesaurus be your friend. Be concise. Avoid redundancy, slang, or jargon. Simplify. Don't pad your work. Don't exaggerate or use superlatives unless you can justify them based on the content. And revise repeatedly. Writing builds confidence, offers opportunities for collaboration, and enriches relationships. So seize the initiative and get ready, get set, write. Thank you so much for your attention. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Christine, who will talk to you about the publication process.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the home stretch of this ALCTS virtual pre-conference, where I'll walk through the editorial production process. First of all, what is it? It's everything required to turn your manuscript into the final product. Whether it's a book, we do all kinds, including guides and multi-author works, an article that appears in ALCTS, our quarterly journal, or one of our online publications like ALCTS News or the White Papers series Z687. Every publisher follows the same basic steps to some extent, regardless of their size. Our operation at ALCTS is about as small as it gets, but it can still get very detailed and complicated. So for a big picture, I'll compare our editorial production process to the land of Oz. Getting here can be an ordeal. Writing, revising, rewriting. Oh my. The storm is over when your manuscript has been approved and you find yourself in a strange new world where you're not quite sure what's going on and you may not be comfortable right away. But friendly characters will help you find your way, explain everything, and support you during your time here. The ALCTS editorial process itself is the Emerald City, where the friendly staff will buff and polish your work to make it ready for the great and powerful reading public. We have to stretch the conceit a bit here because the reading public is obviously more than just one guy, and there are absolutely no wicked witches or flying monkeys. The editorial production for any ALCTS publication, books, journals, websites, consists of 3 proof cycles. The first stage turns your manuscript into pages of a book, journal, or website. The second stage turns the pages into something that looks like a book, journal, or website. And the final proof is the version that becomes the final product. I'll quickly run through the stages to break this down a bit. In the first proof stage, the manuscript, usually a Word document, is delivered to a production manager at ALA, which is usually me or Tim Clifford, our friend in ALA Production Services. We review the manuscript to make sure that nothing is missing or extra, and then send it to the copy editor, who's been hired to style the manuscript according to the 16th edition of the Chicago Manual of Style and our in-house style guide. When the copy editor returns it to us, we check the quality of the copy editing and review any questions that the copy editor had for the authors or editors. Then we send this version of the manuscript to the typesetter and designer, who are often the same person. They design the page layouts and style the manuscript to create the pages of the final proof. Or the first proof, sorry. When the first proof is delivered back to us, we check the quality of that work and then send out PDF copies of these typeset pages to the authors, editors, and a proofreader, who all review the work that's been done. Authors answer any questions that may have come up and clarify any issues. Make sure that the manuscript is properly represented in the typeset pages. Mainly, is it all there and in the right order? The proofreader compares the first proof pages against the original manuscript to correct any errors that may have been introduced, that is, typos and omissions. Sometimes they even find new issues that the rest of us have missed. Everyone marks their corrections and comments in the first proofs, and they are returned to us at the office, where we compile all of the corrections into one version, which goes back to the typesetter, which leads to the second proof stage. This is where the typesetter makes the changes, creating the second proof, and the process begins again, except copies of the proof go to a smaller group than the first time, usually just the editor or one author. They check to make sure their changes were done properly and make further comments if something was missed. When these corrected copies come back to us, we gather them up into one file and send it to the typesetter, who makes the changes, locks in the final layout of the pages, and determines the final pagination. That's for publications that have pagination anymore. Fills in the table of contents, adds cataloging and publication data, and anything else that comes late to the process. The result is the final proof. In this last stage, we in the office review the proof while one author or editor looks it over. If everyone signs off on it, it becomes the final proof. If not, we repeat stage 2 until everyone is happy with the outcome. The final proof then is the version that is sent to the printer or posted to the website. Once we approve that version, the editorial production process is over and the authors can finally relax. In the office, however, post-production tasks begin, including setting up distribution, usually in the ALA online store, and marketing, which includes creating a press release, web pages, and social media messaging. We gather all of the project materials for archival, and we send out review copies and complimentary author copies, and that's my favorite part of the process. So I hope you'll consider publishing with ALCTS. No matter who you publish with, the editorial production process is an interesting adventure. And like returning from Oz, you may not remember many of the details after it's over, but you'll remember your friends and you'll have learned a lot. And unlike Dorothy, you'll have your finished publication as proof that you made it through. Thanks so much for your attention. We'll hand it over to Mary.
Well, thank you, Mary Beth and Pamela and Christine. Before we get to questions, I wanted to point out a couple of upcoming events. First of all, we have another symposium coming up, this time an in-person one through ALCTS, Collection Development Strategies in an Evolving Market, Friday, January 30th. We also have the Midwinter Games coming up. The trivia contest is starting today, actually, so stay tuned for that. And then at the Midwinter meeting, there'll be a photo scavenger hunt, so sounds like lots of fun. It looks like we have a question here, and it's for Mary Beth, but I think Pamela might also have some thoughts about this as well. For academic journals, is it better to do a formal query letter, an email, or something else like a proposal? Is there a standard?
I don't think there is. Informal is fine with me. If someone was making a query about something like a book, something that's much more extensive, and not to say a journal article isn't extensive too, I would suggest a proposal then. But for journals, I know myself I'm fine with informal queries. I get queries from people all the time by email. I also, people approach me at conferences, and by the same token, I do that too. I'm on a number of lists, and if I see somebody's working on something, I might write to them and say, hey, this will make a great idea for a paper, and I invite you to submit a paper. And I've done the same at conferences as well.
Thanks, Mary Beth. I guess as a follow-up question, is it always a good idea to contact editors for a potential publication when you're submitting your work, or does that really depend from publication to publication?
I think it helps. I don't necessarily get contacted by everyone who submits a paper, but I do think it's a good idea. Someone may have questions and we can discuss the time frame for it, or if they had any challenges when they were writing their research, they might want to convey that.
Good to know, thanks. We have another question here. As librarians, we generally have some idea about copyright, but do the editors offer any additional advice regarding copyright to authors?
I mean, I can answer that unless Pam wants to jump in.
Well, Mary Beth, go ahead, and I'll add something based on my experience at the law library.
Okay. For alerts, we have an FAQ. We have two types of copyright. One is the author holds the copyright. The other is that ALA controls it. And the FAQ explains the outcome of both of them, and either one of them is actually fine. And I don't know if that's the best answer to that question, but that's my answer.
Let me just jump in here. At the law school, one of my responsibilities was managing the institutional repository and working with faculty to get their papers into the repository. And when they were engaged in submitting a paper and getting an acceptance for a paper to be published, I would always recommend to them that they make sure that they retain at least sufficient copyright so that they can post the finished paper in the repository. So whatever that takes, if that is a Creative Commons license or some other kind of license, or if they need to revise the license agreement or the publication agreement in such a way that they at least retain that much of a right to their work, that's what I would recommend. Because all of these statements from these different journals can be very different.
Thanks to both of you. Another question I had, you talked about the fact that you need to describe your methods or procedures used to demonstrate your findings in a research paper, Mary Beth. Mm-hmm. But one thing I've always wondered is how do journals or the reviewers evaluate the validity of the methods that a project uses or the statistical significance of the results?
Well, they look at things, as I mentioned before, editorial boards are composed of people who are experts, so these are people who have done a lot of their own research. They'll look at sample size, if they've done a survey, how many respondents they had, how they ranked questions, and if it's not immediately obvious, we'll ask them for help. Not help, we'll ask them to explain further. And sometimes people have faulty research methods. We had a recent case where someone had a survey and the response was very small, but also it was justified by the fact that this person was writing about a very specialized area of collection development where there's literally less than 50 people in the U.S. that do this type of work. So that was justifiable. But they look at things. They look at whether they did a survey, how they counted the results, and things like that. In fact, we have someone currently on Miller's editorial board who is a real numbers cruncher. She's a researcher. She teaches at a library school, and she's excellent in these kind of things. She'll look at the sample size and how they've divided it and things like that. She's very good to have as a member of our editorial board.
Thank you. So one of the things that I've noticed throughout this symposium is how much we talk about the challenges and the difficulties of writing, whether it's figuring out the right methodology or finding the time to write or going through the copy editing process. Could any of you talk about some of the benefits or the rewards you found from publishing, just since both of you have published a lot?
One of the benefits I get from being an editor is I get to read this stuff and people have solutions to things that I can apply to my own work. We're going to publish an article in the upcoming alerts about metrics for ebooks and PDA, which somebody introduced at their institution. I thought, hey, this is great. We can use that at our place. But also as far as the benefits of publishing, you get to share your expertise with others. They benefit from it. I published a book on RDA almost 4 years ago, and I still have people tell me they use it for their classes. And it kind of gives you, I shouldn't say kind of, it gives you a certain level of expertise within the profession and respect from others. I mean, I was surprised something 4 years old is still being used, but somebody told me I still use it for my class.
Well, I'm trying to think what I can add to that. Really, I think that publishing and writing and contributing just contributes to the profession, and you make wonderful friends among the people that you've worked with, that you've collaborated with. It opens doors sometimes. Who knows? It might lead to a job offer, or to other publishing opportunities or presentation opportunities. It leads to, it just sort of, I think, opens or broadens your horizons.
I want to add something to what Pam just said, too. There have been a number of cases, too, where people who are on my editorial board are people who've published papers in the journal. And just like other committees and elects, spots come open. And sometimes I'm able to offer those people a spot on the editorial board.
Thanks to both of you. So I had another question. You had mentioned collaboration and finding collaborators, Pamela, and this was something that was also mentioned yesterday in the Writing for Publication session. What I'm wondering is, from an editor's perspective, do you ever find yourself playing matchmaker or wanting to play matchmaker? Like, if you hear someone who's interested in a project and you know someone else who has similar research interest, do you ever help people find collaborators?
I'm trying to think whether I've ever done that. I think it's a good idea because as the editor you're likely to hear from many people, and some of those things might benefit from somebody else from whom you've heard. So it's possible to put something together. The other way is if you're at a conference or you read something and you know that there's somebody else who is also interested in that topic, you could perhaps put them together if you think that that's a good match. I don't see why an editor couldn't do that. I don't know if Mary Beth's ever had that happen.
I haven't, but I actually, the person I mentioned who said she still uses my book in her class is working on a manuscript and it needs some additional help, so she asked me to collaborate with her, which I said yes, but I just turned in a manuscript for a book to be published in April. I thought, what's wrong with me?
There's a question here that's really to the participants. For those of us who are considering writing an article, are there any particular topics that you are currently looking for articles on that you haven't seen a lot of yet? I guess that's really directed to Mary Beth or Christine in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I'm sorry, Mary, I had some technical problems. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. For potential authors who are considering writing an article, are there any particular topics that we are currently looking for articles on that we haven't received much on yet? And I can share, we do have a list of publication topics that I'll share in the chat, but if you have other thoughts.
Right, I think that's the best resource because so many people collaborated on that list across all areas, all of the sections of ALCTS. I know we're always looking for authors for Sudden Selector guides. Anybody who has collections experience in a specific area, they're very much in demand.
I think that's a good response. I agree with Christine. I also know, at least in alerts, that one area where we don't see as much is on preservation. That's one area where I could always use more papers. There was a paper published by Jennifer Hayne-Tepper last year, but that's one area where we don't get as many submissions. We get a lot about cataloging and classification, obviously, because ALCTS, that's the largest component of its membership, but I agree with Christine, getting back to the point, that list is very good, it's very extensive, it's a good starting point, and she's right, it was compiled from people across the division, so it does represent everything.
Looks like we also have a response here from one of our participants with a suggestion for a publication on transforming data from past perfects. So something to note.
This is the type of thing that would be a good candidate for a notes on operation piece, which those aren't purely research papers. Instead, they're where somebody has developed a solution to something. It could be a problem in the profession, or it could be something that they did at work that was innovative. For example, there was one library that used a LibGuide to communicate technical services policies and changes to their library, but that would be a good candidate. I don't have any experience with past perfect, so I'm not sure how to go about that.
May I ask a question? This is Pamela.
Of course.
I noticed that in the questions that were, or the information that was asked ahead of time, a number of people did say that they were interested in mentoring. And I was just wondering if, Mary, you could say anything about what the Publications Committee is discussing with regard to mentoring. It seems as if there is, at least among the people who responded to the survey, some interest in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're actually in the early process of kind of forming a proposal that we might take to some potential mentors to see if we can find a group of mentors for a pilot project. I think we are interested in it, but we're also mindful that we want it to be a process that's well defined so that the mentors and the mentees both understand the obligations, because I mean what you're talking about is a relationship with time commitments. So we just want to make sure that the process is positive for everyone. But yes, we've heard from several different venues and from a number of people that there is interest in a mentoring program. So we're interested in pursuing it.
There are also opportunities for anyone to get in touch with any of the ALCTS editors. I can provide all of the email addresses. They're general generic mailboxes where you can deposit a question.
And I included some in my resources slides as well, Christine.
Right, I'll put the list of all of them in the materials that the participants receive.
That would be great, Christine. Thank you. I guess I'll give everyone a moment for any last questions you might have for either an editor or an experienced author. But what I'm wondering from all of you is if there was one other thing that maybe didn't fit into your presentation that either you've learned from your own mistakes or that you would want new authors to know. Is there something that sticks out?
I think the hardest thing is to know how long it's going to take. Many people, I think, are used to writing on the web now, and there's not a lot of time spent on revision, and I'm not sure that people really want to spend that kind of expend that kind of effort. I don't know, Mary Beth may get a number of submissions. I'm not totally familiar with what's going on now with the ALCTS monographs, but I know that when I was involved with the paper series, it was sometimes extremely difficult to get people to follow through because of the time commitment. So I think the biggest thing is don't bite off more than you can chew.
And sometimes there have been people who have, speaking of the time commitment, who've chosen to withdraw papers for that reason. They said, I don't have the time to revise this. Or there have been cases, very few, where someone would return their revised paper with all the track changes in it and say, okay, I agree with this. And I'd have to explain, it's up to you to incorporate those changes and then submit a revision to me. That it's not something I'm going to do. And I also think people should realize that it's okay to make mistakes. You have to start somewhere. You're going to make mistakes inevitably and learn from them, and that includes rejected papers. That's not the end of the road. You can learn from that. And I've rejected some papers. I saw them published out somewhere else, because one of the things I do is even if I reject a paper, I will still give that author a marked up copy and explain what the reviewer said. And there have been times when people followed up with me. Sometimes their feelings are hurt. Others will say, okay, what are my next steps? So I guess editors are also like, there were a couple things that Pam said, magicians, and I forget what else, but also maybe like counselors or therapists as well.
Well, it is hard being an editor because you never know how people are going to take your comments, and I'm a good example of that myself. I mean, sometimes people corrected things I did, and I'm really offended, I have to admit. So how could they correct that? I spent an hour slaving over that sentence, and they don't like it?
Being an editor has made my writing a lot better. I was working on something today at work, and 3 people were working on it. We shared a contributor part, and I felt a little uncomfortable, but they would make a statement without something to back it up, and I say, give an example. Why is this important? What's the impact of it? And I thought, oh my God, I'm copy editing the report.
That's right. Well, that's why I say don't exaggerate. It is so easy to write, this was the best report I ever read, or this was the best something, or the biggest something, and then you think, really, can I justify that?
I think one thing that's important too with writing is to think of your audience, to explain things clearly. When I was the editor of ALCTS News when it was still A&O, one of my jobs, my primary job, was to get all the people's conference reports, and they varied so widely. Some people wrote very good reports. I told them to write the gold standard reports. Some people would just give me a couple sentences. Some you would think they were writing a blog. I mean, they were all over the map.
Mm-hmm.
And in pulling them together, I mean, I didn't mind, but it was just interesting, the variety in styles. And I always had to follow up and check things. One thing I did have in my slides, which I removed because I thought it went without saying, is that if you include people's names in your paper, be very careful that you do spell them correctly. I recently got a paper I referred to an author's he, and I wrote to the author and said, that person's actually a woman. You need to make sure that you check all these citations thoroughly.
Right. I loved what you had to say about the copy editing, Pamela. That was the best example, not to say the most. I don't know if I can back that up, but that was the clearest. It was wonderful. I highly recommend that advice to all the attendees. It's a great example.
Well, not seeing any other questions, I'd like to close now. But first I want to thank Mary Beth Weber, Pamela Bluh, and Christine McConnell for your engaging presentation on the publishing process. I also want to thank all of our attendees. We hope that you found today's session useful, and you will soon receive a short online evaluation form. So please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your comments are very valuable to the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Information about all ALCTS webinars can be found on the ALCTS homepage. Suggestions for webinars and other continuing educational opportunities are welcome at any time. You can either contact a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, or you can submit a proposal for a webinar using the online form on the ALCTS webpage under Online Learning. Finally, I would like to thank Mary Reeder for providing technical support for today's session. The support that she and her colleagues on the Technical Support Subcommittee provide make it possible for us to present this virtual symposium. Thanks again to all of you for joining this afternoon and in previous days, and we hope that you will participate in other ALCTS events very soon in the future. So thank you and have a great afternoon.